Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to GeOCHemISTea, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. Our mission is to inspire future geochemists and to introduce our listeners to niche geochemistry topics. I'm your host, Sam Schur, and this month we're having a panel discussion on leveling geochemical data with Pedro Acosta-Gongora and Tom Carmichael. Pedro is a geochemist from the Geological Survey of Norway, and Tom is a mathematical geologist and one of the founders of DataRack, now part of Index. Pedro, welcome to GeoChemistry, and Tom, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you for the invitation. Very excited to chat, discuss, and I'm sure learn a lot from Tom and his mathematical savviness. It's good.
Yes, and thank you for setting me up with someone who can absolutely embarrass me with how bad my geochemistry is, Sam. Thanks very much for that.
It's all about the balance.
So good.
And putting friends in places. That's all it says. Tom, you've been on the show before, and as we say, are distinctly not a geochemist. So anyone that's curious about Tom, I recommend that you head to our episode from season 1, I believe, where we talked about spatial autocorrelation, which still does my head in. But you can learn more about Tom there. More interestingly, Pedro, can you tell our listeners a bit about your journey into geochemistry?
Of course. Yeah. I think that now I'm pretty much a master of none, because I started basically as a field geologist. So I did my bachelor's at University of Costa Rica. And then over there, I moved to US. I did my master's over there. It was in mineral exploration. So I worked in Peru a little bit. So I did work typical or economic geology type of studies. And then I moved to Canada and the same thing. I was more focused on mapping, isotope chemistry, main and trace elements, geochemistry, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of regional mapping. So when I actually moved to Canada, I ended up working for a number of years with the Geological Survey of Canada. So over there, we had these very big, like regional mapping projects. So that was pretty good. But then at some point, I think 2019 or something like that, earlier than that, this wave of machine learning and a little bit more geostatistics started to, I'll say my 2015, something like that, it started to really pick up to the point that started to come to the survey. So I remember there was this colleague, Chris Lawley, which is now a professor, I think, at University of Ottawa, or Carleton, I don't remember now, but I think it's Carleton. So anyway, so he had a conversation and he was like, hey, have you tried this software R? No, what the heck is R? Well, you can do nice plots and things and that. It's quite a learning curve because you have to code. Have you coded before? No, never in my life. So anyway, so I took the chance. I bit the bullet and I started to learn a little bit of coding with R. And with that, of course, I really dislike it at the beginning because I can just go and click in Excel and do the same plots way easier. But then eventually I realized that I could do more complex things and I can suit better my plots and everything started more visual way. And then I started to realize, well, this visual thing is cool, but there's other things I can do. I can find patterns better instead of me looking at 2 or 3 elements or doing a huge correlation matrix. Then I can actually do things a bit more visually appealing. I can do dimension reductions. Ooh, that's cool. And then that's when I started to get a bit more into this more geostatistical world without having truly a mathematical background. So everything that I have been learning is just basically very empirical. So now I'm at this point that I really this part of more applied geostatistical part of geology. But at the same part, my background is geochemistry, is not mathematics. So then I try to combine both. But of course, when it comes to the more heavy processing of data, sometimes I make mistakes. I've done a lot of them, from transforming data to a bit more complex things now that I'm working a bit more with the more supervised learning stuff and trying to achieve deep learning models. But yeah, so of course, it is quite a challenge because I'm not a mathematician or a computational geologist by definition. But this is it. So I started as a basic mapper, economic geologist, geochemist, and now I'm more into data. So now I know a little bit of many things. So I'm a master of none.
That's amazing. How'd you get to Norway though?
That's a beautiful story as well. So basically, when my postdoc was about to finish the Geological Survey of Canada, by that time, I think that we were like probably 8 postdocs in Ottawa, and there was one position open. So there was like the Hunger Games of the postdocs, isn't it? Because it was everybody against everybody. And of course, I didn't get the position. So then one day, I'm applying to different jobs, and then my wife sent me this email saying, "Look, there is this position in Norway." And I read through the position. There was nothing that really made match with me. But there was one line, very little, that said, "It's an advantage for the candidate to know how to code in R." I'm like, "Well, I can do that. That's okay. That's my thing." So then it suits a little bit my resume to whatever they want. It was more like an environmental geochemist, which is basically what is done here. So I sent up the email. A couple of weeks later, I was in Costa Rica, and then I got an email saying, "Oh, do you want to come to Norway for an interview?" Sure, why not? Isn't it? Very skeptical, but I'm like, in those days when you could still like travel to the country for an interview, no teams, isn't it? It's pre-pandemic. Amazing. So then I went to Norway. I think it went okay. It turned out that the person that was interviewing me was going to be my boss. Then she knew a person that I worked with at the survey. So it was like a good chemistry and everything, but I wasn't sure. 2 weeks later, I get the offer. And then I told my wife, "So what are we doing?" Because she had a great job in Canada. She worked for the National Research Council, permanent job and everything. When I'm getting this permanent job in Canada, in Norway, it's not as well paid as her job. So I am extremely grateful that she moved here. And we were lucky enough that she actually got a job here. It was pretty much the same thing that she was doing in Canada, equally well paid. so then equilibrium is maintained somehow. So it was extremely random. It was because of my wife. I had nothing to do with this.
That's bad. Well, that's great.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, well, I guess it comes like full circle, full loop.
It is, yeah. So it was her fault. She was the one that sent me that ad.
I'm saying nothing. Okay, so look, what I'm thinking now is that even better than one bit of gossip is two. So starting with you, Pedro, since you're already chatting, what did you bring us for tea time?
I'll tell this story because this is a story that my supervisor always tells to random people when I'm around. And this is a field story, of course. Let me see if I remember correctly. It's been so many years. And of course, I was in the right side of the story. So she remembers it way better than me. So what happens is that we were in this mining camp in the Northwest Territories called Terra Mine. That's a former mine, fast producing mine. So we were there, and there was like facilities that were quite limited, isn't it? So there was I don't think there was very little water, like tap water, and there was not much over there, isn't it? So one of the key problems was that there is no toilet. There was a toilet, isn't it? But nobody was using it because we all assumed that it was not working. But I didn't know that. By that time, I must admit that when I got to Canada, my English was not great, isn't it? So then there was a lot of things that were like passed me by. One of those was that there was a toilet, that the toilet was not working, isn't it? So I am an early riser, very early riser. So I was up maybe 5 a.m. or something, but I would go to the toilet, and I'll go to the toilet work perfectly, isn't it? So then, and I did this maybe 6 days that we were there. But by the 6th day, I was a little bit later. So then when I went to the toilet, I came out and I can see my supervisor. She's livid at me. "What the heck are you doing?" And I'm like, "Going to the washroom." "What? There is a washroom working?" "Yes, why?" "I have been going to pee and do the other thing in the bush, and all the mosquitoes are biting my ass, and you are here using the toilet." And I'm like, "I didn't know I couldn't use the toilet." "Yes, you shouldn't have used the toilet." and I think she was in a tent with another colleague. So this other colleague she like peed like on a bottle or something. So it was like this horrible like thing to hear at night, isn't it? So all this like poor Sarah, she was having to go out into the bush and do her thing and get her butt bitten by mosquitoes. And I was just putting my beautiful ass in the nice toilet and doing my thing. And nobody realized it until that day that I was a little bit later. And everybody's, what the heck are you doing there in the toilet? There's water in the toilet. Nobody knew there was water in the toilet. Of course, there was no water for everybody. If everybody had gone to the toilet, then there is no toilet for me. Yeah, that was the thing that she always tells to everybody. And because I was on the right side of the story, but of course she remembers that way better. Yeah, because she was in the bad side of the story.
I can't believe it's been 50 episodes and it's taken this long for somebody to tell like a toilet story. Like, this is very on brand for me, so I'm just shocked.
Oh, I mean, I had other ones like missing in translation that are probably a little bit, yeah, probably not, but they're funny. Yeah, especially at that time in Canada was quite funny because my English was not great, so I was still trying to like understand some Canadianisms and like some phrases, and I could still like not express myself accurately. So I remember one time that I was trying to explain that I was a swimmer when I was little. But I remember that when I was little, I could not do like freestyle. But I like to do the doggy paddle. But by that time, the style in Spanish is estilo. So I translated directly. So I like to do the doggy style. And of course that brought a lot of laughs. I didn't understand like what was going on, what was everybody laughing. But then eventually I understood.
I
This is
love
in
those.
camp, isn't it?
My friend calls them, what are they? The false friends. They're like a false cognate, how they just don't directly translate. I'm guilty of that 10,000 times over in Spanish. Yeah, that's amazing.
There you go. So I was very popular on that table in the camp. That was also in camp, so yeah.
I remember real quick, I remember telling my Nana in Chile, I remember telling her that because I was going on a trip, and I remember telling her that I was excitada, so I was very excited to go.
Yes,
except that
I
to
mean,
our listeners who are in Spanish speaking, that means that I'm also sexually excited. And then when she was able to explain this to me, I was like, "Lo siento, estoy muy embarazada."
Oh, first.
But then that doesn't mean I'm embarrassed. That means that I'm pregnant. And this woman was like super Christian, and she's then panicking, crossing herself in the kitchen when I'm telling her this. So yeah, nope, you got doggy style. I have pregnant and excitada. So yeah, it's fine.
My wife did the same. Yeah, my wife did the same. Yeah, back home in Costa Rica. So she was saying, "Oh, estoy excitada. I don't want to do that." Yeah. Not in the right setting. But
No.
But it's funny. But you're right. Yes, that's a good one. Excitada. Forgot about that one.
Thank you very much, Pedro. That was fascinating. Also, to our listeners, Pedro's story was told to us like 3 weeks ago. So here we are starting again. Tom now has internet and service and power. So here we go. Thomas, what did you bring for us in terms of gossip? Let's hear.
Sam, you and I are like long-term users of company geochemical data. This is something that we have to deal with. There's always like warts and all and everything else as well. And I was thinking the other day of I had to go rescue a data set for a client that they hadn't seen in quite a long time. They just needed some results. We'd sent them yonks ago. And I remember my favorite part about this data set is that they had duplicates of a data set in their Excel sheet that they'd sent us. And I was like, oh, it's that classic thing where they were doing intentional duplicates or something else. And what it turns out had happened, that this multi-million, billion-dollar company had just accidentally analyzed about 10 of the same samples 4 times each. So they just had them sitting in their database. And so they were ever so slightly different. They were just like, they weren't field or proper dupes. They were just stuff that they'd collected, had accidentally put in the calico bags and just thrown in and sent to a lab. And I remember just sitting there being beyond confused and thinking that it was some like amazing QA/QC procedure that they might be putting in place, or they might be trying to like really get this good broad spectrum analysis of this sample that they were looking at. And no, it was some turkey shoving stuff into a bag, had shoved stuff into a bag incorrectly. And then they just sent to the lab and made them go pay $55 a sample of the same thing on repeat. So
it's one thing to have done that twice and feel like, okay, we messed up 4 times.
Phenomenal. Absolutely
phenomenal.
Amazing. It is one of my favorite things, because I remember looking at that data set and just thinking, oh, there must be so much of this great things to do because they've been so careful without the way they've collected these samples. And turns out, no, they hadn't been careful. They just, some fieldy had just been keep putting dirt into a bag. And here we were. So there was nothing to learn whatsoever from that, what could have been such an interesting data set. So I thought it makes me die a little bit inside, Sam. So I hope it makes you die inside a little bit as well.
Yeah. And having just done like a wonderful piece of QA/QC for a current project that I shared some photos with you of, I'm just like, it brings us actually full circle into what's the next step here, guys, which is what we're talking about for the show theme, really. So I'll just get right into it. I want to say to all our listeners, this is our 50th show, which is to me a little bit unbelievable. Yeah, we can all lightly clap here. So
don't want to ruin the sound, just lightly clap.
Yeah, because we still don't do really any editing. So yeah, please don't ruin my sound. So for the 50th episode, you would think that I would do something more interesting, but I've been so bogged down in so many projects with legacy data, and I have not grown any less interested in it in the last few years. And so we're going to step into a topic that sits quietly behind actually a lot of regional geochemical map data, which is data leveling. And we're doing regional geochemical surveys in particular because Pedro works for the Geologic Survey in Norway. So it's particularly relevant in his case. And I think just focusing on something here is just a better idea than just talking about leveling in general. But we can do that, and we might. So we'll see. So look, guys, when geochemical data sets are collected over decades, analyzed by different laboratories or produced using evolving analytical techniques, they rarely are going to line up perfectly. In Tom's case, they might. Leveling is a process that we use to correct for these differences so data sets can be merged into a single coherent map. In practice, geochemists often rely on reference materials, batch controls, and normalization factors to remove analytical drift and align these campaigns. But interestingly, and I bet everybody's asked themselves, why is Tom here, a non-geochemist? We brought him in for a mathematical perspective because the question in here is going to become a little bit more complicated, which I love and I find maybe too fascinating for my own good. So here, the questions may be, what exactly are we correcting and how do we know we aren't also reshaping the geological signal? So today we're going to explore that tension between practical geochemical workflows and statistical rigor. And joining us, we've all probably a little bit introduced at this point, but I don't remember because it was 3 weeks ago. We are joined by two experts. One is grounded in applied geochemical surveys, and that would be Pedro, and the other is approaching leveling through mathematical geology and data theory, and that would be Tom. Let's get into it, guys. To start us off, what exactly do we mean when we say leveling a geochemical data set, and why has that become such standard practice in regional surveys? Do you want to take it first, Pedro?
Yeah, if you want to see it from a practical point of view, it's when we say that we need to level the data, it's basically we want to make the data comparable, to compare apples with apples. So often when we get data from the lab, you have like different surveys or different media. Well, usually you don't do that, don't combine both. But the point is that you will have variability in the data that is actually not geological signal, but it's analytical noise. So then the idea is that we want to remove that analytical noise in order that we can actually compare the two data sets or three data sets, or I don't know how many data sets we put in together, in order to have a leveled background in which we can see what's high, what's low, what's in the middle. And then, of course, for that, then we can account for anomalies for different purposes. That could be for mineral exploration, that could be for environmental purposes, that could be for ecological mapping, etc. So in a way, in practice, when I say leveling data, is basically literally just making everything comparable, data comparable, so we can compare like apples with apples.
Tom, you want to take it from here?
I think that's brilliant, Pedro, because I am absolutely not a geochemist and I will never be a geochemist. And so the way that I always think of it is that if I'm trying to solve a problem with geochemistry, then what I need to do is I need to dilute all the noise out of the data that I have as well. And how I do that is any number of different ways. You might be actually just trying to remove an artifact that is a function of unleveled data. And what I would need to do from someone who is not going to approach it in a way that's going to make very many geochemists happy, but will hopefully solve a problem, is to go and say, what is the minimum amount that I can do to level a data set out so that the primary signal that I need to solve for is still applicable in there? And that's a very nonsense way of saying exactly what Pedro said. But from my perspective, I definitely just think of it as a signal problem as much as everything else, because there's a few papers that have come out recently, we don't have to talk about any ones in particular, that have started to approach this as a more traditional signals processing and sampling theory thing, which I really like, because often depending on what problem you're solving for, if you're trying to solve for a regional geochemical problem where you might have, say, dozens of different methods, and you might even not know the methods in some case, you might actually not know which ones are similar to each other to group together. That's obviously like a massive undertaking, which actually requires deep domain expertise. Often, if you might have 2 generations of geochemistry, which is quite common in a mine environment, which is where I tend to spend a little bit more of my time, you might end up with something which is the thing the exploration team uses, which typically the exploration team is going to be using something maybe a little bit nicer. And then you're going to end up with the mine who might be doing, hopefully not 6-element geochemistry, but might be doing 6-element geochemistry, and then even just trying to compare those across things. So for me, it's about how do I dilute enough of that noise out of that problem to get an answer back for me.
I love this. And I think we've already really answered the second question in talking about this, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just to have granularity for all of our listeners that are as fascinated by leveling as apparently we are. So from the perspective of, you guys can't see us, but we're throwing up our hands, being like that emoji, like, of course. From the perspective of someone working with large national or regional surveys, what are these real world problems that leveling is trying to solve? We've talked about different labs, different analytical methods, decades of sampling. If there's anything else, please throw it out there. And how do these realities really force us into leveling data sets?
I can just start again from the a bit more applied point of view, and obviously
I
I can
love
just
that.
I can just talk about what we pretty much do here in the survey and a little bit what we used to do at the geological survey in Canada. So I worked in both, but mostly here we have different purposes that I have already mentioned briefly. So we have, of course, you try to gather these geochemical data sets, first of all, for regional to local geochemical anomaly mapping, oriented, of course, to mineral prospectivity. So that's very on board now with the critical mineral push from the government. So now Norway, that is not particularly a mineral resources from like the metallic point of view and resources, it's more focused to oil. So they don't have that big industry, but now we're seeing that push. So now that means that we now need to not only create more data, but we have to reanalyze or reinterpret the data that we already have, isn't it? So then this is when it comes crucial to paste together or put together different data sets. The other important use for our regional data sets is for environmental purposes. So basically we want to establish background levels, isn't it? In order that we can assess where in which areas there could be potential anthropogenic pollution, contamination, isn't it? So then we need some sort of like a baseline to say, okay, this is what naturally occurs. So everything that is on top of this is likely coming from some sort of like anthropogenic activity, and that has to be handled accordingly. And then more recently, I've been also involved with ecological mapping, which it seems to be that here in Norway, the content of calcium in rocks that then transfers to soil is actually quite associated with high biodiversity. So then what the government wants to do is to identify these areas that have high contents of calcium in order to reorient resources to preserve those areas, isn't it? So then it's extremely important to identify those areas that have, in this case, calcium. Calcium has other elements that are associated with it, like magnesium or strontium, for example. So then it can go from a univariate to a multivariate problem easily. So then again, this is a little bit of the applications that we have. So of course, when dealing with different data sets, what happens is that we need to somehow level, because if we don't do that, then what could often happens is that you either overestimate anomalies or underestimate anomalies. So then just think about mineral exploration. You can identify anomalies or in a specific area that are basically just artifacts. Or you can underestimate anomalies that are not precisely, you don't see them there specifically, they look like background, but they could be signaling something. But since these two surveys or more are not level, then that could be a problem, isn't it? And the same thing when it comes to the, for example, the ecological mapping or the environmental approaches. The government is going to use these maps that we produce in order to make policy. Obviously, not only these maps, there's like a series of criteria they're going to use, but of course, these maps are going to help to make policy, to make decisions, to orient resources. And of course, the more accurate that we are, the better maps that we do, of course, is going to save the taxpayers' money, of course, because we work for the Geological Survey. But at the same time, it's going to help us to identify what is really the problem, how we can solve it, how can we remediate, isn't it? So from the applied point of view, these are like the important issues that for which leveling could be extremely important, or is extremely important, because it allows to pre-process the data in a way that allows, again, sorry for the redundancy, to obtain more accurate results, and results that ultimately will lead to better predictions, which is all that we want to do. We want to predict which areas we have anomalies. We want to predict in which areas we could have contamination. We want to predict in which areas we will have more biodiversity. It's all about that. So pre-processing it's key before you use any sort of like fancy machine learning algorithm, deep learning, whatever you want. If you don't pre-process your data properly, and that, of course, involves leveling as part of it, then you are not going to get the desired results. So I think it's, what do you call it? The GIGO effect, garbage in, garbage out effect.
I think you bring up a really good point before, like a quick side quest before we throw this at Tom as well, is are we doing this leveling one time with all the elements, or are we doing specific elements in specific ways at different times?
It's interesting because just by looking at the data sets that I've worked with, some elements are better than other ones. Some elements can be leveled, others can't. And that could be for many things, isn't it? That could be because the standards, if we use the standards, for example, you have the concentration levels for some elements in the standards are too low and they cannot be quantified properly. So therefore, you cannot really see what's background and what's noise. The same thing if you do reanalysis. Some elements, they almost don't need leveling. And especially, there is a myth about the major elements that, all major elements, they should be okay, even if you use two different methods of quantification, which sometimes is true, but sometimes it's not true. So one has to be very careful with it. So I guess, I don't know if that was your question, but from the way I understood it, it's a little bit more tricky because although we want to see this as a systematic approach for every single element, the reality is that we have to evaluate this element by element because not all of them will be possible to level. And then you have to leave some of them out because you just can't do it by a normal regression, for example, which will be like the most used approach.
Yeah. And the way that I've always thought that is that there's two things that you're trying to solve for here. One of them is an assumption that everything is measured equally, but to different levels of precision. But then if you have something that might be chromium or gold in an aqua regia data set, we actually know that you're going to be only partially digesting a whole bunch of that material. So practically, you start to actually lose the equivalence there because you have two things that are going to be the equivalence. And what you hope is that some of your majors are going to be behaving, famous last words, in relatively the same way. But I think the thing that I particularly liked about your example from before, Pedro, is I do like it when we level for a purpose to understand something. Because I think if we just go and carte blanche level an entire data set and just do a regression and just go to either BL method or all those different methods, then I think we're in danger of ironically polluting our ability to level if we use those truly quantitative methods. I think you see that. I don't think it's Norway. I think it's the Finnish Geological Survey who's done a whole bunch of rock sampling across their entire country that you can go look at. And you can see there's really strong populations, which if you just go and light it up by method code, are just method code. And I think that's the part that becomes really hard, is there's just some elements which are going to be naturally more easy to level. And there's going to be other data sets which is due to the nature of what they're actually measuring. If they were done with two methods which are fundamentally different, that they're not. And I think the one that you described there, where you go and say, I have a mechanism for the thing that I'm interested in, calcium, and here's what I need to do, and here's what I can think about the sensitivity and the accuracy and those things as well. Particularly if you start to look at some of those, I guess, those quantile regressions that people put through, where you go and say, I'm interested in the magnitude of the value as an overall whole, rather than an exact ppm or percent value in the case of calcium. I think that, for me, is actually a really nice application. I think every now and then you do see, like, there's a few papers around where they just put everything into the sausage maker and then they get an answer out at the end. And I'm not an entire believer in that, or I haven't seen that necessarily be super effective. But I think what you've described there is really nice. Choosing a major element, making sure you can get a major element to work out of a data set is a really good place to start. And then when someone starts asking you to do trace elements and all these other things which will have been measured incredibly inaccurately in the first place, then I think that's where you can decide where the biggest effort's going to be worth actually putting in to get your data into the right shape.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, because often now with the raw materials push, you start to see these elements, like rhenium, osmium, palladium, indium, which everybody's looking after those. But when you have an aqua regia data set, all of those are pretty much under detection limits. And it's almost impossible. It's just not possible. You can have just a handful that might be above detection limit, and probably they're at detection limit, which already tells you that's, it's probably not that reliable, that data set. So then there's one thing that, this is when you go from like the politician to the scientist to the data scientist. They want to do these things. And they say, okay. And actually, I will say that you go to the politician, you go to the director, survey director, and then you go to the actual data scientist, because the politician tells you, okay, we need to push for this kind of mineral resources. Director of the survey tells you, okay, I know we have data sets that contain these elements, but the data scientist will tell you, well, you know what? Yeah, we have those elements, but the problem is that we just can barely quantify this, and we cannot really do anything with this kind of data sets. It gets complicated, and of course you have to, and that doesn't mean that data set is a bad data set. It just means that for those specific elements, it's just not possible. So then you're right. You have to be specific on the purpose of for what do you want to use the data sets. And maybe for ecological mapping will be perfect, because you need calcium, magnesium, iron, things like that, strontium, and that's fine. But if you want to go for more of these critical raw materials, raw minerals, raw elements, whatever, then that becomes a bit more complicated.
I love it. And yeah, I think, to add in my 2 cents too, data leveling is always a huge hesitance, because in what I do, whether it's exploration or mining related, it's typically large suites of elements that I need to use. And so where it becomes really tricky is that I'm not focused on just one thing. I'm focused on maybe 10, 12 elements or something like that to build whatever model I'm trying to do. And then it becomes really tricky as to how much we're altering the data set in order to get to a place where we maybe want but shouldn't be. So yeah, tricky.
Yeah, just one more comment on that one. And you're absolutely right about that, because what happens is that, again, in this, I think now, like most of us work with multivariate analysis, and it is very rare that you just go for one element or two elements. That those days of just using gold or using silver or stuff like that are, well, not gone. They are still useful, but that's like a complement in some way. It has to be part of something that is bigger. So yeah, so the problem is that when you have like data sets in which some elements are good, but other ones are not that great, then you start to play these games about, okay, if I'm going to do a multivariate analysis, I need to choose only those elements that are reliable enough. And then you start to play those games as, I don't know, let's say arsenic is very important, but then you are missing arsenic in half of the data set, isn't it? But you know that when it's there, it really signals something. So then I guess the point is like, yeah, you need to start to see the data set not as all variables can be systematically leveled or corrected in the same way, but they are, in a way, one's better than other ones, and you have to account for that in some way.
I've recently been listening to back to some of your like older episodes, Sam, and they're always like these super entertaining, engaging speakers talking about the state of the industry. And now what you do is you've got me and Pedro who are just like zeroing in on a hyper specific mathematical thing. So apologies if this tanks the podcast. We'll do our best.
It's just the podcast. and here 50th episode, let's have a little like a rabbit hole with this one too. I find that the podcast is often a platform, whether they're very broad or it's very highly specific, because I've done other ones that are very in the woods before. I just did one on isoscapes that I just can't get over. For forensic geochemistry, who the hell knew about that? But now I find that when we're in something that is highly specific, it's just better to go and just do every single rabbit hole we can, because it's oftentimes that it will be for those select maybe 50 listeners that have ever had a question about data leveling. And this will be just gold for them. You can't read this in a textbook. All the different opinions and from multiple sides of the problem as well.
But you know what? I think also it's here at the survey, I often do, well, not often, maybe once a year, I do a talk that sort of try to explains a little bit of approaches to compositional data, QA/QC procedures, to machine learning. So it's almost like building this from like pre-processing to choosing the data correctly to do the more numerical stuff. And at the end of the day, what I want to inspire my colleagues is a little bit of curiosity about the data sets they use, isn't it? Because I think most geologists, and I was just like that because I was never trained on data, ever. We're trained on many other things, on field work, we're trained on geochemical analysis, we're trained how to interpret geochemical data. Isotopes, call it whatever, call it major, minor elements, trace elements, call it isotopes, isn't it? Like, we're trained on that. We know what's the meaning, but we don't see, but when it comes to putting data together, and especially this time of big data, isn't it? This is the big data time. So this is when you really have to start to put different data sets together. And this is when it becomes crucial. And of course, a lot of colleagues, they just put all the data together and they do this kind of like isotopic maps or like major element maps. And let's say visually they look good. But if you want to do something more quantitative with it, not only qualitative, then it gets tricky. So I guess a bit of my crusade here in the survey is to try to show also the people that it's important to think about these more obviously boring things that have to do with the data pre-processing, but they are very important, and they can have very important consequences for the models they eventually will produce, isn't it? So yeah, like before, people was more concerned about your own data sets that you do for this particular project, and that's like it. That was my PhD, my thesis, and that's it. So then it's like valid. But now, you're gathering data from different places, and this is when databases like GeoRock or something like that are becoming extremely important. But at the same time, you got to know how to put them together because it's not as easy.
No, and I agree, and I think, and Tom's been a large part of this. I've been on a massive historic legacy data crusade of my own making, for my own learning. It's been a process for me that he's been just lucky enough to be on with me. But I find also there's a fascination that I have, not because I'm particularly good at math, because I am not, but this fascination that I have because our data in geochemistry is so inherently mathematical for many different reasons. And to not appreciate that, we lightly throw out terms like compositional data, but then I find when I'm giving courses, there's actually a lot of interest as to what that means. It's hard to get into in a 2-day course, right? What that really means and all of the ways in which you can and you can't treat the data. So it's also been interesting to figure out how to teach that to people, just all the different areas to be careful in, because you want people to be able to deal with their own geochemical data. That's the dream. But at the same time, it's just this pre-processing step. People take QA/QC and they have that as something that's just this very distinct phase that you have your database and they take care of it. Well, number one, they take care of the ore element and that's it. So that's just step one is the problem. But then step two is just that before you can even touch your data, there's that whole pre-processing stage. And if we're not touching that and we're just moving on, everything is wrong. You're not going to have anything that is working. And I've seen so many talks that have just gone about that. And they'll just make these conclusions and you don't want to call them out on it because that's rough to be called out in a meeting or something. But it's also, you want to talk to them about it, or you have a podcast where you can talk around them. and about it.
Yeah.
I think there's a fascination there because a member of this parish, Mike Whitbread, used to be my boss many moons ago, and he used to sit next to a geophysicist called Neil Hughes, and they were two of the smartest applied people in their fields that I'd ever met, and they were really good at teaching me how to think about data and processes and streams. But essentially what their entire logic and ethos boiled down to, which is, it sounds a bit like junior to go and say, but put your thinking cap on for a second here and then be like, do you think this makes geological sense? Do you think this is real? And then go figure out why that is. You need to know enough about the process, enough about the methods to go and say something intelligent about them. And then you can go back and go do it, because we've all seen these things, right? Especially with things like catchment analysis and everything else as well, where people will be trying to level things, or they might, and watersheds is another one, which like I see like geochemical watersheds being used in just phenomenally ambitious ways to try to understand data. Not because I think anyone is being disingenuous in the way that they're thinking about it. I think it's just because A, it's really hard, and then B, there is a high degree of being quantitative in there, but there is also a degree of qualitative understanding. And in the case of someone like Pedro, who will have seen data sets from across an entire country and will understand that data implicitly and will get to know all the nuances of it, knowing that is just incredibly valuable as well. And I think that's the thing which I always find really interesting. So I'd push ever so slightly back, Sam, on the idea that your math isn't good. I think the application of it is a lot more important in this case, because you see a lot of people just, as you say, like just applying compositional data analysis approaches to certain things. And I look at it the same way as people who just throw machine learning at something for fun as well, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. And if you don't understand the process and everything that goes behind it, you end up in the same place where your ability to split out analytical like noise from geological signal becomes basically null. And I think this is the thing, if you can't expose that and you can't explain the logic of how that's done, then it becomes really hard to go and say, how am I going to use this data to then actually go solve the problem that I need to go solve? Because ultimately, creating a beautiful, well-leveled data set is fantastic and is like good in itself. But more practically, it needs to be used to solve a problem. So have you actually done the work to actually go solve that problem well enough to meet whatever criteria that you have? And I think that's the thing which becomes really interesting to me in this space.
Yeah, and I would just leave one last comment here, at least from my side, in that I love using iogas. I think it is an amazing tool for geochemists, but it makes it really easy to level entire data sets all at once with a click of 3 buttons. So your point here is really invaluable in the sense that shouldn't be done. We should be thinking about the implications, the geologic implications of what we're doing before we do something like that. And we definitely shouldn't be doing 48 elements all at one time, because that's where we're going to run into some really big hiccups. And you won't notice it.
I'd absolutely love if that was the case, where you just press a button and all your problems would go away. I would love,
Yes.
If anyone can build me that button, I would be
Please
really
build
happy
us that button.
with that button in iogas. That'd be fantastic. So that'd be really good if you could make that happen, Sam.
I think that then this transitions nicely. And if people are like, how long is this going to go on? Guys, this is going to go on for a long time, I think. Anyway, let's get into some maths here. From a mathematical standpoint, what concerns, Tom, will arise when we begin applying correction factors to entire data sets?
I think largely it becomes what is the level of like irreducible error that you have in a lot of these samples, because there's going to be some error which is going to be reducible, and there's going to be something which you can go put on a regression line and then hopefully get it to look something approaching reasonable. And then there's going to be irreducible noise that's in there. And the problem is it's really hard to ever know exactly where that line is between where you get from real signal through to something that's actual data. I think we've done the thing that always happens wonderfully on this podcast, where we've covered a fair bit of ground at once.
Yeah.
But the disentangling those two things is really hard. And so I think the thing that I always think about is that you have to know that irreducible noise is going to exist, particularly in analytical data, and particularly if it might be something like a soil geochemistry data, particularly if it's a survey data that's been done quite a long time ago or something else as well. There's got to be a relatively higher value in that irreducible noise. So your ability to completely level and completely square out that data set is going to be probably fairly low. And that's the way that I always think about those things, is that you've got the geological signal you're looking for, some analytical method, and then irreducible noise. And you're trying to think about those three factors as you push through. You'll never know how much of each there is. There's just simply no way to do it. So I tend to favor, if I'm entirely honest, more simple methods for leveling, because then at least I know what they've done to the data. There are very complicated methods you can do where you can start trying to predict below existing detection limits and everything else as well, which I know are popular in some parts of the world, but scare me a little bit, if I'm entirely honest with you. So that's the way that I tend to think about it. Those are the three pillars that I think about when I'm trying to normalize or level any of these data.
One of the biggest challenges in geochemistry is separating real geological variation from analytical artifacts. So how confident can we be that leveling procedures are removing instrument bias rather than geological signal? And I think we'll start with you here, Pedro.
I don't know if I can tell you like a mathematical reason for this, but something that I've seen while trying to level different regional surveys that have relatively high density, especially stream sediments, is that it depends, of course, the approach you use. I have been very unlucky sometimes, and then I have had no, let's say, common standards or common reanalysis or anything that can tie all those surveys together so I can make some sort of like regression a correction using a regression. So then what I have to do, because I don't have the budget to basically reanalyze everything, is to apply something like C-scores, for example, which of course have lots of limitations, but it is what it is. And what happens sometimes is that, yes, it looks like the map, it looks, let's say, more visually appealing, but in some areas, there are some, let's say, copper or iron concentrations that they are exaggerated because of the batch effect. That's a given, but there is a signal over there. But once they apply C-scores, then that signal is extremely diluted, isn't it? So I guess that could also be a problem, as you said, when you level, that sometimes this geological signal can be diluted to some point. So then it's okay, we level, but then at the expense of decreasing the geological signal. And of course, this can vary from element to element and from problem to problem. And my problem was very specific in a way that, as I said, I had a very bad data set. But if you perhaps are dealing with a data set that has better QC parameters, then perhaps this dilution or this distortion of the geological signal could be less. But in my experience, dealing with pretty bad geological data sets, I've seen that. So yes, leveling can definitely distort the geochemical signal in non-trivial ways.
Yeah. Oh, Tom, you go. I'm just upset.
And I think Pedro specifically hit on a really good point on the front end of his answer there, which goes and says, what are you tying your data to? And I think if you go and say, I have some kind of standards which have been analyzed in the same way, I have some kind of overlap or reference sample which I can build a regression from, that's really handy. And then I think you do get into the minimum boundary distance, some of the more modern methods for geochemical leveling, which are relying a lot on that there is a spatial continuity in the data that you are then going to try to correct and identify as well. And I will say there is some quite good literature which says that's an effective technique. But I think for me, it becomes really hard to understand how far to push that data because, as we were saying before, major elements makes a lot of sense. You're probably going to get things which are going to be relatively homogeneous in terms of, Pedro was talking about like calcium in soils and everything else as well. You're expecting that to be probably fairly mobile. You're probably expecting it to be fairly continuous in its behavior through a particular media over a small or a large area. Whereas I think when you start to go looking at other elements, and we touched on it as well, where we can talk about some of these elements which might have really small localized effects or might be hard to identify if the spatial patterns exist in the same way, it becomes really hard to trust that data if you don't have those reference samples to cross with on that. And so that's when I start getting worried about that signal to noise ratio, where we start going, that geological signal's definitely still there, but I know that my background analytical noise is going to be higher. And so it becomes, I can apply whatever method I want to that. I can try to apply some kind of leveling factor. I can try to just normalize the overall populations to get the distributions to look the same. You can do population fitting or something. That is where I personally start to get a little bit worried, and I wonder about the use of this, because the danger is that at that point, all we're doing is creating a very pretty map. And I think the danger for a lot of these things is often that we go and create this very beautiful map, which we've gone and leveled and normalized, but we actually have probably diluted the signal so much that it's going to be hard to use this data in anger. And so that's the way that I've always thought about it, is you probably have two phases. One of them when you do have cross-references and samples to go build a regression from, and other ones where you are using a different technique, which basically means that you're going to be leaning very heavily into, I really hope the spatial patterns in this are contiguous and that I have enough information to get it there. And so that's the two things that I tend to think about, particularly when we're trying to separate that noise and signal from each other.
Yeah, and something about this that really upsets me is just talking from my perspective. Pedro's qualms are working for government, but working in an industry setting, the amount of times that you're going to have either information still about what reference samples were used, even in a recent campaign, no less in an old campaign, especially with how much projects get bought, is limited. Plus, then you're going to have the ability to actually get overlapping samples is rare.
Yes, that's correct.
People do not want to reanalyze for a particular reason, especially if they see it as being a little bit academic in nature. It's not to say that you can't, if you think it's something that's really important, you can't convince a company to do this, but also your sample size is going to be very limited. And you're not going to be able to do it from, say, if you want to try and get the whole representative feel of the ore body or anything, you're not going to be able to really get this. So it becomes this thing that's limited a little bit to academia, and it's shitty because it shouldn't just sit there because we're losing a lot of information from samples. But I just feel, anyway, it's not just a problem in the government. We have it over here too.
Yeah, and one thing that we have to do when we don't have like this, again, these common samples, as I said, for example, something like C-scores, which is widely used. It's also entirely dependent on I think what's appealing to, which is like the geological patterns or continuity, isn't it? Because one of the problems is that, and I've seen this firsthand, is let's say you have two surveys, and then in one survey is dominated by limestone, and the other one is dominated by basalt or granite or something. And then you want to do C-scores independently. So of course, that's going to be complicated because the C-scores, if I remember correctly, is basically how many standard deviations plus or minus have you at the mean. So then, of course, you know, that the level for a limestone and for basalt or a granite is going to be very different. So then that's going to start to introduce other problems. If you are, for example, in an area where, you know, the two surveys are covering somehow like equivalent geological units, so then that's better. But if for some, or if you have two surveys and they just have like different densities, for example, different scales, but they're covering roughly the same area. So then that's somewhat better because they're covering the same geological units. But then you start to get in very real problems when you have two different surveys covering two different geological units, or very distinctive, very contrasting. And then when you want to do a very specific, like statistical based leveling, that just becomes a nightmare. Yeah.
I think we just transition into my next question about reference materials and control samples. We don't just spend a ton of time here, but I would just like to address it specifically because we've talked a lot about it, I think, at this point. But just the fact that most leveling workflows rely heavily on reference materials that are analyzed repeatedly across batches, which in a good QA/QC program that may happen. But how robust is that approach mathematically? Are we assuming things that about analytical drift that may not always hold? And I would say also, etc. So Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously the dream, right? Because this is the way that we do any kind of either internal batch leveling. If you're doing an XRF sample, a survey, and you're doing something between different NIST samples and you're going to grab them with the XRF and you're looking at instrumental drift or something that's localized, through to actually doing something where you might go and say, well, I've got 20 samples which are actually referenced across both surveys that have been analyzed with both methods and everything else as well. I think there's two parts of that. One of them is, and I think you hit on it in the last time, that's a really nice luxury to have. And I think if you have that, it's nice to have had like that kind of foresight. Often either the original reference material will be gone, so you can't go reassay it, or for any number of reasons, it's not going to be the same in terms of those things as well. I think the thing that becomes really tricky is you've got to know what that is. It's not entirely unreasonable to assume that if you, for example, had two CRMs across the different surveys, if you were very lucky and you'd used the exact same CRM across different surveys and you knew what the difference was between those, if you had different digestion methods or something, that'd be great. I think there's also probably a realistic probably thing we have to face, which is it's very unlikely you're going to run into that. So I think if you've got those reference materials, if you've got that, it's fantastic. That is just the way we've always corrected for drift or for any of those things. It just seems very unlikely that it's going to be one of those things that you go and have. But if you've got it, it becomes just the backbone for anything that you actually go and correct for there.
Yeah, not from the analytical point of view when you talked about standards, because that's definitely not my gig. But I can tell you, for example, when it comes to making field standards or our in-house standards for soil, isn't it? Because we send samples to the lab, we make our own soil standard. And of course, these are not synthetically created standards. We're basically going to this place, we're getting this bunch of soil, we're mixing it, we're sieving it, we're mixing it, and we analyze this soil many times to see if it's indeed there's some sort of like homogeneous signature for most elements. But of course, there's going to be variability, isn't it? So then, you're going to have variability, just natural variability of that standard, because it's not a synthetic standard. So of course, that's going to introduce some error when you try to use that for correcting, even if you're using a linear regression. But also not for all elements, these standards are good. Our standard is definitely not good for a bunch of elements. So then you start to realize, well, again, as we talked about, you can correct for some suite of elements, but there are some that they just can't, the standard that you have, we just can't. So so then you have, the analytical part, but also the standards that we use, the material standards that we use that are not synthetically created.
I think that's a great point. And I think that there's so many of these things that I just also have massive opinions on as well. But in looking for progress in this conversation, let's continue on. Because I think a great thing to talk about is scale. Leveling often happens when combining, as we've said, different analytical methods, different sample media, different time periods, particularly with the finishes. The instruments can have a very different problem. So are there cases when leveling simply shouldn't be attempted? In this case, when the data is fundamentally incompatible? And I guess I would just tag on to that. How do you know? And I think the answer is you've spent a lot of time looking at the data, but I think to our listeners, hearing that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the thing, and maybe just to provide like a bit of context of, I think one of the more, and excuse me, you can bleep this out, Sam, but like one of the bigger oh shit moments I ever had, I think was we were looking at a data set that a client had collected about 150,000 meters over their deposit. They'd done a combination of diamond drilling and RC drilling. And we definitely saw that even with diamond holes that had been drilled right next to RC holes, which are in theory collecting the same media, they're obviously collecting it in slightly different ways in terms of the behavior, and there is ever so slightly a sample bias between RC drilling and core drilling. So that they were finding that they had bias in those two samples, right? Which are just, those are two things which we just think, we just assume are the same. They could see subtle shifts between their RC and diamond drilling that they'd gone and done. And I think that is a little bit scary. But then you go and say a soil survey where they might have been like digging for a particular horizon. They might have then sieved to a certain size fraction and then gone and set that off for analysis. That information is where we start to get into the really, I guess, the heebie-jeebie stuff there. I think what you do have to do is you have to know as much about the sample in terms of its metadata as you can. And that metadata actually goes beyond method code. So we often think of the method code as being the thing, but I think often the sample media is a pretty underappreciated part there. I know we've definitely been asked to do a lot of work across the years of essentially trying to match things of different sample media to each other, because there is actually a much bigger difference than was assumed. And you get turbo dorks, like a lot of people that you interviewed on this excellent podcast, Sam, who find that stuff really interesting. But if you don't have someone who's not really careful with those things, it's super easy to miss them. And I think it's a matter of getting your sea legs under you and making sure that you can look at the data. But those sample media can just absolutely make that data drift beyond different things. And I think, again, Pedro was making a really nice example earlier of talking about some environmental control data. I think you have to know what the purpose of your data is. There is a reason to level things, and then there is a reason not to level things. If you're doing it for a particular purpose and you know why you're doing that, I think it becomes a very easy thing for you to internally know when to stop or when to keep pushing. The problem becomes if Pedro goes and levels a large data set, a national scale data set, it becomes a tricky thing because you don't actually know how that data is going to be used. You don't know how that data is going to be used in 5 years when they go and say, oh, this is a perfectly level data set. And then someone's going to try to do something with it, which might affect that data. So I think it's always really hard to walk that line of going to say, why am I doing this? How far should I push it? And then is there anything that I should be, like, again, trying to think of in terms of how this data is going to be used going forward? I'm not sure if you've got any thoughts on that, Pedro, but that's definitely the case for a lot of the data that I've looked at across the years.
Yeah, I just want to make one correction from my answer before about the standards. When I said mixing, I think I meant homogenizing, because I'm not mixing different things, but in Spanish, like mezclar means to mix. Like,
I love it. Sufrir, my favorite Spanish word. Everybody's suffering.
It's homogenized, not mixing. Okay, so said that. There are a couple of things that are quite interesting that you said when it comes combining different media. But even in the same media, it's something we have experienced as well a lot. We have this, I don't know if we talked about this slightly, but it was sampling uncertainty, isn't it? So then what happens is that you will have 10 samplers out there. And often you don't have 10 top quaternary geologists doing this work, isn't it? So then you are going to have sometimes students, sometimes people that are not even geologists, but are trained for a summer job, isn't it? Sometimes colleagues that are not quaternary geologists, like me, for example. I'm not a quaternary geologist and I'm taking soil samples. And then, of course, we go out first and we try to train people. Okay, you got to look for this particular profile in the soil. But the reality is that when you go out in the field, things are very different. The soil profiles are not like theoretically, they don't have all the horizons. People get confused. And it's very difficult to actually quantify what's the quality of that material, or even to say if they are taking like the horizon we're looking for, isn't it? So then even at that level, not even combining sediments, stream sediments with soil, but only with soil, that gets tricky. And you can have a lot of heterogeneity and a lot of sampling uncertainty. And that has also, sometimes we try to account for that. Sometimes in our surveys, we have different options for C horizon or B horizon or meteorites, but it has the same problem, isn't it? You really know somebody that really knows that profile to mark the correct term for those things. We developed this method to sort of correct this sort of sampling uncertainty, but at the end, we came back to the same problem, because you got to be a very good geo also to recognize all those different profiles. So yes, it is complicated. So of course, when you want to expand and combine different analytical different methods, for example, either analytical methods or media, then it gets quite tricky. Yeah, it's my 2 cents over there.
Yeah, I didn't even think about the sampling, but now I'm recalling 2008, me in the Yukon. Sorry to the people that I worked for, but I did the best that I could. There was also permafrost at the time, so that was tricky. But it was really tricky to delineate, is this B or B1 or whatever it was that they were trying to get, right? It was just very unclear in the distinction, because you're also relying on color, which is not a great thing as we know as geoscientists, but it's something that really had to be taken into account. But my brown was very different from my boss's brown, that much for sure, because he was telling me this is a light brown. I was like, this is clearly a chocolate.
I've definitely done the opposite experience of, I remember digging for B horizons in about 35 degrees C, 100 degree F, looking for a B horizon in the Northern Territory. And I remember being like, I don't know how much digging I've got left into me. I think there was certainly a lot of A horizons. I'm guessing I probably sampled during that day, where I was like, I don't think I have it in me.
I mean, you bring in something too, where in the Yukon, where I wasn't, because it was mountainous, so I didn't have to worry about tills. At that point, you're talking about what is even real, quote, real soil there, and what is regolith. 1,000 things, guys. That's for a different podcast.
But it's like a fascinating thing, though, right? That, again, at the risk of going off topic again, I think that is one of those things where I think of a lot of times that I've spent. I am not a soil scientist. I am not a geochemist, but I'm certainly not a soil scientist either. And I remember we spent a lot of time thinking about what is the actual sample media we wanted to sample. What was the thing? What was the purpose of even the sample before we actually went and analyzed it to go think about watershed analysis? And yeah, I definitely remember just me in a fieldy going out into the middle of nowhere, being dropped off in a helicopter and then being told, walk that line every 150 meters and collect samples. And Yeah, I would argue that to Pedro's point, that not the best sampling was ever done. So GeoChemist, I'm sure, did the best they could with the data that they received back from there. But I would have thought the uncertainty was probably just as high from the sampler as it was from the sample, if we're entirely honest.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you made a good point, isn't it? Even if you are the best quaternary geologist ever, soil scientist, if you're at 40 degrees, isn't it, in the field, and you are taking your last 10 samples, you definitely you might not get the best sample. You may get something contaminated. You might be like, you know what, screw this thing. I just want to take this thing and just go and move on. So it is complicated because that systematic assumption that we have with the data is not there. But people somehow assume that because we publish these data sets by surveys or companies or whatever, so then the data is perfect, isn't it? The data is not perfect even from the very beginning, which is getting the material, isn't it? So all these things it comes to the problem of leveling because we start to see those variations perhaps in areas that are not in two samples that are not too far away, that's supposed to be the same soil, and you see the description and both are pretty much the same texture and colors and things. But suddenly you see this huge difference in geochemistry. So then what happens over there, isn't it? So then it all contributes to the error, but we just put it under the rug and we just don't talk about it.
I would say too, for explorationists out there that see something like this, that's a good reason why you don't just be like, oh my God, there's an anomaly. Let me stick a drill hole in there. You could if you had unlimited funds. But that's a really good reason why you would go out and you would do some additional testing of an area before you spent all the money, because it could be as something as simple as your person was tired, or they just didn't nail the correct B horizon, or you guys were doing C, whatever it was.
It could be a number of things.
Yeah.
No,
it could be real.
It could be real, yes, of course.
If you see 10 grams of gold, just stick a hole in it.
Yeah.
If it's marginal,
it's good. Yeah, and don't use like your wedding ring or something when you dig the
hole.
hole.
Well,
That's another one. Yeah. But that all those little things that we have to account are the problem with this sort of uncertainty is that we only talk about the type of uncertainty that we can to some extent correct. But when it comes to sampling, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because how you're gonna ensure that everybody's taking the same type of sample. And to be fair, sometimes it's not even the sampler. Sometimes it's even that particular horizon is just not there, or it's like very thin. So it's gonna be contaminated by whatever is above and below. Yeah. So nature is not perfect by any means, but we have very little. It's very difficult to correct for those sort of things. It's more difficult to correct for different media, for different analytical techniques. That's relatively easy, but correcting for sampling uncertainty, that I argue that's almost impossible.
You're making me like I'm just about to start my day, and now I'm like,
doubt everything. Oh yeah, I went through the deep on the rabbit hole with this thing.
No, I love it because all of our rabbit holes are following the questions, but I just think that these questions require just like also to be very clear with people at the same time. I'm not going to pat myself on the back, but they're pretty decent questions for this. Look, so again, and we've talked about this, but we can do some of these as one-liners now if you want to. But again, I think it's important just to put these little nails in the coffin. Nobody's dying in the field season this year, though. National surveys aim for these seamless geochemical maps like we've been talking about, but exploration geochemists like myself, we typically work at much smaller scales. So, Pedro, would you argue that leveling matters equally in exploration programs, or is it mainly a problem for regional mapping programs?
I think, it depends in application, as we have talked, but
yeah,
of course, when I say that I've worked with a bit higher density data sets, we're talking about 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers data sets. So it's not even like the kind of exploration that you guys will do. But for those surveys that are local, we call like local surveys, then the leveling as we know between different surveys is not required, because usually we just have one survey and that's it, isn't it? That's what we do. So that's not required. Then what I've been trying to do is to level, but for like different soil types. You have like different soil types that have been recorded. So then you level through these things, or level also for geology, especially if you are going after anomalies, isn't it? So if you're looking for some sort of VMS type deposit, but you have basalts and you have granite or something like that, then of course you're going to find more anomalies. in your more iron-rich units, which doesn't mean that you have the VMS there, but it just means that it's naturally more enriched in these more pathfinder elements. So for those leveling, yes, I do. But for we're talking here, yes, I do not know. But I usually work more with is trying to stitch more regional surveys, because now we are at the point of trying to produce these national scale products. So this is why we are going for, national scale, but also what we call here a county scale, which will be, if you are Canadian, it will be like a province. If you're in the US, it'll be like a state. So that's what we do here. But yeah, I don't know. You will have to tell me when it comes to exploration. I don't know how does it work. You just take several batches in a single season, or just everything is analyzed at the same time in the same exploration season. Or I'm actually quite interested to get your point of view.
Tom, do you want to go first?
I think it's largely dependent, I think, on, without sounding too silly, like it's a lot of it's company maturity. To think about, if I'm going to be here for 3 seasons, I'm probably going to use something relatively consistent, unless I go decide I need an over limit or a different finish later on, because I've actually decided that I need more granularity on something. Generally, there's going to be a lot of consistency. I think what you see often is it's that stitching part, which is where things get a bit tricky. It's where you go and say, I know that I might have a regional survey, which is really good, and it might be handy to stitch that regional survey in terms of taking some of that geochemistry to give you some ideas of how you might actually be doing your own orientation survey. And I think that's the thing, where often you actually want to stitch those 2 data sets together. You will want to use the regional data to then inform how you go to your exploration sampling, but you probably never want to stitch them all together into a single data set. You actually probably very explicitly want to keep them separate, and there's like a bunch of reasons for that. And I think if you go and look at the work that Geoscience Western Australia has gone and done with the GeOChem and some of the statewide maps as well, those are really good. And you can see where they've gone and reanalyzed like a certain type of regolith. And to Pedro's point about, like, you can start to see geological terrains basically pop out straight away before you even go do anything. And that's really good. But I think that becomes then, what are you trying to do, right? Are you trying to stitch all these together to go find there's different terrains? And then how are you going to normalize for that? Are you going to go and say, what does anomalism in a regolith in the Pilbara look like versus regolith in the Yilgarn for these kind of pathfinder elements for gold? Like, it becomes like a broader question. And I think that the better geochemists I know are able to hold both of those things in their hand, where they're able to say, here's the amount of information I can probably go get from my regional data set. I used it to inform my orientation survey or something. And then you're probably never going to truly stitch them together, but you can use them to go and say, here's what maybe a qualitative relationship might look like between there. But Sam, you'll definitely have more experience than me on this. Your opinion is probably going to be more valuable.
No, I think that was really good points and a good jumping point. I think the first thing that I would comment on is, a lot of times I'll see exploration programs for a costing measure. I'll see them use PXRF, which, like, in general, it's not a bad strategy. It's just that generally it's not calibrated. So a lot of times you'll find me agonizing over the fact that I just generally have to tell people that their data isn't up to par. If they still have the samples, it's very easy for them to reanalyze them, and the cost is just labor at that point. And just having a call with me, which they already have me on retainer, so it's fine, but just showing them how to calibrate it for specific elements and elements that are going to make the most kind of bang for your buck. So that's the first thing that I notice. And then after that, I would say, and Tom knows all the time, because I think all we do lately texting each other is talk about legacy data sets. So analytical methods just drive me wild. They both fascinate me, and they also just are the bane of my existence. The way that I generally deal with it is, unless for some reason there's an absolute requirement to combine them, I will just treat them separately. And I will find elements that work in both situations. So I will limit, in a way, my 4-acid interpretation for geology, say, if that's of interest, but limit it in the sense that I'm only, say, working with scandium, and I won't be working with niobium, because typically you don't get niobium in an aquaregia. So I will play with things to figure out what it is that I can use, and then try and replicate what I've done in the aquareach data set, working more, as Juan Carlos Ordonez loves to say, in the simplex. Grunsky likes to say that too.
Exactly.
So that's a strategy there. But yeah, analytical methods. And then also the geology is tantamount, right? Because as you pointed out, Pedro, if you have a massive copper anomaly, but that copper anomaly is a basalt versus a granite, then it's not actually an anomaly. So looking at what the Clark values are of the different rock types in the region, or in a way making my own, if there's no data available, that's also going to be really important. So yeah, between analytical methods and geology, I think those two are really, for me, like the governing that. And I should probably read deeper into some things, because I'll oftentimes do go through all of it, be really upset about things, and then just realize that if I had just looked at a map, I would have realized that they had sampled all these things in regolith or something stupid like that. So just making sure also at the same time that we're always sampling the same thing. And it's easy to say, oh, it's B horizons or whatever, but as I say, Sam, in 2008, I was 1 year away from having a bachelor degree, and they had explained to me a B horizon, but what I did, I can't guarantee that it worked 1,000% of the time, because you can't always, as you say, you can't always find it. So then you're doing the next best thing. You're making notes, but people don't always read the notes. Yeah. So it's just one of those things that on the exploration side, you just have to be really careful about. And that carefulness often lies in the metadata. So I can't tell you how many probably database managers are just exasperated with me because of my love of metadata and being like, what more do you have? Give it all to me. Because it's just trying to accommodate for all these problems I know that I'm going to see down the line. And I'm going to see these perhaps anomalies that don't really make sense. And again, if you got 10 grams of gold, you got 10 grams of gold. Like, that shouldn't happen. Maybe it's from upstream if you're looking at stream sets, but at the same time, like, those things are always going to be like, we have something happening here, we got to figure it out. But if you have things that are maybe say 500 ppm of copper or something like that, yeah, that's a little bit marginal. We might be in a basalt, but we also should look at this more to rule out that it could be other things, and probably some follow-up is going to be required before I say, hey, drill a hole here. So yeah, that was fun. I don't usually talk this much.
Oh, it's good. That's very enlightening. But you know what? I agree with your point of view. I do the same in terms of the analytical methods. I try to keep analytical methods separated unless for some reason I have to combine them. But it's that I try to avoid that, because and especially here, like usually I have lots of aqua regia and sometimes for acid, but for soils is mostly aqua regia what I have. So then it can be very tricky. So I agree with you when you say keep. And also if you are like let's say a junior exploration geologist, and you are like you get this bunch of data, it's always good to know, if you don't have the experience and the knowledge to combine those things properly, try to keep those data sets separate, and it will probably be a good idea.
Yeah, do set separately, but then also just know that
yeah.
in what I found as well in the wider geochemistry community, and I would argue many people that have been on the show, we're very open to asking questions. So just send us a message on LinkedIn or something like that, because nobody's generally interested in what we do. So when we get somebody that's interested, we often are like, hey, I got 10 minutes to answer this question. So
yes, definitely.
This is one of those things that we're going to beat, I think, leveling at this point to death. But it's a good one because I don't know, I find it's this topic that both is a very old topic, but also is a bit of a renaissance now because of the push for a lot of data science. And it's just one of those things that we're innovating new things. The old things still generally work, but the fundamental problems are never going to go away. So talking about it like this, I think, is completely invaluable, especially from multiple different perspectives. So that said, and we've talked about this a lot, and that's the risk of beautiful maps. One criticism that we've had throughout the history of leveling, way before I was even born, not to call out other people, but one criticism is that it can produce these very clean looking maps that 100% are hiding underanalytical, that's a new word, underlying analytical inconsistencies. To both of you and whomever can take it first, do you think that leveling, maybe in the past, maybe even still today, and interested if you've been reading newer literature, but do you think that leveling sometimes prioritizes this visual continuity over scientific transparency?
You can have it there, Tom. I will follow your lead.
Yeah, yes is a one-word answer of yes. Good enough, Sam. And but I think there's a few papers that I've seen come out recently from Sinoprobe in China and the other ones they're being very clear that actually what they are trying to do is beautify this data for mapping purpose so you can see broad scale trends to go identify things that might be interesting, right? And I think that is an approach to solve a problem. And this is the dead horse that I will flog on this episode, is to go and say, you need to be thinking about what you're doing and doing that. I think if you go and say, my goal here is to go join these things together and to go and build something that looks more continuous. And I think that's actually going to be a helpful representation for me to understand broad-scale watersheds, large-scale cryonic structures, or something else as well. Probably is okay to go do that. The question then becomes, how much do I trust each individual data point to then go and say, I'm going to go take this data point and action it in some way? And that's the risk there of those beautiful maps. I think they're nice. I think you see them, and I'm a sucker from anyone else if I go see a really nicely put together watershed map that's been normalized the hell out of. I think it's nice. I think it serves a purpose, but I think it then becomes, what is that purpose? And if that purpose is to get really broad scale information, probably fine. If I then want to go get really granular information, to your point before, Sam, the metadata and everything, but what the actual value originally was, is going to be much more important to me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I think it depends on the scale, isn't it? I think that sometimes the regional scale that I work most, or province scale, actually find that continuity, it's quite revealing, because it can give you a little bit of a larger scale structure that might contain something interesting, isn't it? So sometimes when you are at the regional scale, having just one sample that it's maybe not seeing it from the point of view of a concentration, but if you're using PCA or UMAP, some sort of score that is multivariate, represents some multivariate analysis. So then having several of them being anomalous is actually better, more robust than having only one, isn't it? But of course, when you start to zoom in, that one anomaly could be just one anomaly and could lead you to something interesting as well. Of course, you never do this. You never do this in the void, isn't it? Geochemistry, it has to be associated with geology, with structural geology, with other types of things. So we never work only geochemistry. But since we're just talking about the maps, I think what Tom said is completely right. It depends on the scale you're working. Sometimes you want to see that spatial continuity in order to identify areas that could have higher potential. And then when you are there, you zoom in, as you said, then probably that you want to keep that noise as well, so the data is more fair and it's not whitewashed by any sort of statistical handling. So yeah, both serve a different purpose, I think.
I think that's really interesting, and using that to then go into the next question, which is, with machine learning and modern statistical tools, we now have ways to detect batch effects and analytical drift. Do you think that the future of leveling will look different from traditional normalization approaches used in surveys like the G-based survey?
I have not tried myself any machine learning to deal with batch effects, but I definitely see it coming. Why not? You can probably, I'm guessing, treat this like any other prediction, classical machine learning problem, random forest. But then I think it becomes a little bit tricky. But I don't know. I guess the simple answer will be yes. My guess is that machine learning is going to come to this field. But myself, I have not seen it yet, and I would like to see how useful this will be with respect to the old method. And again, I don't know, I'm not an old timer. I like to try everything. But for example, now that you have, let's say, something simple, dimension reduction methods. So you have PCA, which is factor analysis, which is quite old and robust, and then you have now UMAP, isn't it? So then people is now using a lot of UMAP, it's nice, it's non-linear, it can give very pretty signatures. But at the end of the day, you have this UMAP, but then you in some way you can identify better patterns if you want. But when it comes to identify what are those clusters, what are those patterns, a bit more difficult, because UMAP doesn't give you loadings like a linear approach like PCA will give you, isn't it? So then it both has pros and cons. I am all to go and try different approaches, But it will be good to see what is the real robust advantage between one thing and the other one.
Yeah, and I think you have seen some statistical changes, I think, over the last couple of years. So I say a couple of efforts at leveling geochemical data using spatial statistics and everything else as well. So using some of the work from the Atchison family of analytics and everything else as well. So some of the more modern stuff that's come out of that world, there is a bit of stuff in that literature. I don't think any of it's really taken off, if I'm entirely honest. Like, I think, and it's very good in theory. So a lot of stuff they're trying to borrow, which again is for when you don't have overlapping samples, but you might have spatially related samples. Again, probably a little bit more to create beautiful maps rather than to actually go and do that. I've also seen people try to do things where they try to co-correlate it with other data sets. So where what they'll be doing is they'll be taking multimodal data. So what they'll be taking is, say, flown hyperspectral surveys, flying hyperspectral surveys over their geochemical samples, co-referencing those two together, and then going to say, well, if we've got an X amount of accuracy on our sample location and an X amount of accuracy on our hyperspectral scan our airborne hyperspectral scan, which might have a few hundred bands. They're not going to have a direct correlation with each other, but we can build a relationship between those two things. And then we can go and say, here's where we have something anomalous, or here's where we have something which actually might be not related, or we think there might be something. This is where that relationship breaks down. Therefore, that leveling might not have been done correct. It's not perfect. I haven't seen it used in anger to really solve a problem, but I know those methods have been used with some success, more in the QA thing rather than leveling a massive data set. Because in that case, you need, after going to all that trouble of going to collect your samples from the surface, you then need someone to go fly you a 2-meter hyperspectral survey, which is no cheaper than actually just going back and reading and analyzing your surveys.
Yeah, but also like when you're like now using remote sensing for some sort of like validating the geochemical data set, then it's limited to areas where you don't have vegetation, isn't it? so then it just narrows it now, because here at the survey I was part of this project with the Norwegian Spatial Agency, and they were trying to push for what we can do with remote sensing data in terms of geology. And we actually come to the conclusion that not that much, because what happens is that we have a lot of vegetation here in Norway. So then, of course, when you want to do any sort of correlation between the bedrock and the spectral signal, is very difficult because it's going to be disturbed by the vegetation. So you can read 1,000 of papers from Egypt and Australia, isn't it, Iran, and all these great places that this works amazing, but you'll see none from Brazil, from Costa Rica, isn't it, from Norway, because it's very difficult when you have that problem. Again, this, even if it comes to the point that you can really calibrate this, it will be only applicable for certain areas.
I'm not sure Sam's done enough on geobotany, so maybe there's actually another episode in this for Sam for looking stuff, because I think there's another episode in there for you, Sam.
So. There is another episode in there. I'd have to think about who I wanted, but then there's also, and it's not huge, but it's exactly to your point of what can be done with spectral signatures in forested areas. And there's some people that are trying to be a bit clever about it, but it's also not something that is widely applicable. So yeah. Let's get to philosophical. I was going to say philosophy, and then I went philosophical. I'm not sure how that turned out, but anyway, it's still for me early in the morning, no coffee yet. It's fine. I'm not editing any of that. There's too much editing already in this. I have to limit myself somehow. Is leveling here, is it fundamentally about improving the data or about making the data usable? And also, are these things the same or perhaps not? It's tricky.
It's tricky.
Yeah.
It's tricky. Yeah.
And I think I'm a bit of an optimist. Like, I think if you're an exploration geologist or you work in exploration geology, you have a natural optimism, right? And I think you will. And Pedro's point about I'll try anything. I'll try anything, right? Because I'm like, I know we're limited in the amount of data that we have. I'm going to try to push this data probably much further than I'd like anyway. I think at that point you will just throw things at the wall, because you're like, I do need to try to extract the most value out of this data because it's high leverage data. It's going to help me make a decision, which actually might be me deploying millions of dollars worth of capital to then decide whether I'm going to actually pick up this tenement and do proper exploration and everything. I always sit on the thing that you're going to wring that every last bit of data, value out of that data that you can. And so I think you'll do what you can. And I think that will be the thing. I think it becomes a little bit different if you're like, I want to come up with an entirely new leveling method, which is going to be applicable around the world. And I'm just going to go throw it at any data set and it's going to work out of the box. I think that's different. But when you're looking at things on these smaller scales, I think you're going to do what you can to try to get that information from there. So I'll be the eternal optimist and go and say they're both trying to answer the same question. Both sides of that are the same. It just depends what your use case is and the fact that we all know that we're limited in our overall data that we have and what we can do with it. So I'll take at least remotely the glass half full approach to this.
Yeah,
Very American of you.
There you go. Yeah, I think if the phrase was if leveling improves the data or if, again?
Making it usable.
Making it usable, yeah. I think a bit of both, but it depends what you understand by improve the data. Because the reality is that from the way I see it, if you ask me, does it improve the data? I say no, unless you have an instrument that have a lower detection limit, isn't it? And then that's the only way you can improve the data, but the data was still the same. We're just trying to clean the data, isn't it? Just somehow enhance the signal. So it's not per se making the data better. The data, it is what it is. But we're just making it less noisy. That's what it is. And comparable, yes, of course, because by applying this sort of like these statistical filters, we're making it more comparable and usable. That it all comes to that. You want to compare like different surveys so they are usable. So it's definitely a little bit of a philosophical question because it can be, it depends how you interpret it. But I guess both in some way. I wouldn't call it improve the data per se, but definitely help us to make it less noisier, which somebody can say, okay, this is better data. But it's not better. It's just the same data, just like cleaner.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective and how I use data, it's about me trying to make the data as best as I can without fundamentally changing it. If I have to fundamentally change it, as you say, Pedro, there's only so much I can improve the data, right? Like improve in quotes, right? But making the data usable so that I can answer the questions that somebody has brought to me. And that doesn't always work. Yeah. I don't know that they're the same thing for me, but I know that they are related. But I'm also terrible at philosophy. So maybe this is the wrong direction for a science podcast, but maybe not. Final question, which I'd like to close with something that's more forward-looking. The young geochemist is trying to build a regional data set today, combining legacy surveys, new analytical methods, modern stats. What principle do you guys think should guide them to deciding whether or not to level their data? So in other words, what is the one mistake you see most often people make when trying to fix their geochem data sets?
I think the problem number one is that people just don't try to fix the geochem data at all. People just compile everything, isn't it? Just put everything in Excel sheet, make a shape file, put it there, make an interpolation, or just look at the raw values of the samples, and then that's it. If you get to the point that you are thinking, okay, what's the best approach to correct my data? You are in the right path already there. Again, so you are already thinking in the right way, isn't it? But I think that the biggest problem is that people not thinking about it at all. And of course, it's a little bit tricky to just say, what is this principle? Because it will depend on the data set you have, how you approach it, isn't it? But I guess the rule of thumb would be like, if you have different data sets, the first thing that has to come to your mind is you just cannot put them all together and then make a big list and then interpolate that and then use that as a single unity. There are potential problems. I think that if you can at least identify that, then you're in a good track over there. Then you can send an email to Tom and to Sam and to me, and they can help you with that stuff. You guys can charge. I cannot charge. So
first question I'll give away for free. Second question we'll start to charge.
We'll start to charge.
Okay. And if you're working for a big company, we're charging from the beginning. So it'll be great.
There you go. So request to some shared consultant, whatever it was, Gmail. I don't know, what's your email?
We'll put it in the show notes for people to email all of us with the questions. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I don't know. Tom probably has way more insightful advice than I.
No,
I would say though that was excellent advice in general. That if you're asking the question, you've already got to step one. So I think it's great. Tom?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more there, Sam. I think that's the thing as well, where I think of the grounding that I have in geochemistry, and a lot of it is just about the idea of saying, what can we do with this data? How do I understand it better? And I think wanting to get a really good fundamental understanding of these data sets before you go and level them and everything else as well. Again, maybe I'm a bit naive and a little bit glass half full. If I see people in my sphere who are doing that, like I employ a lot of early career geoscientists. Also, we employ a lot of early career geoscientists at Index, and we do a lot of that. It's a lot of it is to go and say the people who I think are the best are the people who are willing to learn, ask questions, go through that data, and then by the time they get to a specific question like leveling or using that data in anger, you have a pretty good feel for if someone's going to pick that up quickly. And I think people who want to know more about it are the people who are always going to be the best at these type of things and are going to be able to make leaps of logic and join things together. Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore with the sentiments of Pedro on this one.
Yeah, and I would also conclude by saying that even though I graduated with a degree in geochem back in, I don't know, I did my master's I think I graduated in 2012 with it. Anyway, even though I've been technically a geochemist for quite a while now, this isn't the only topic that gives me trouble still in terms of when I get a data set, ultimately, what do I want to do with it? And really having a think, spending time, all my contracts, if they're in geochem, there will be at least a 2 to 3 day, depending on the size of the data set, discovery period, where it's just me just hating life, looking at data sets. And the QA/QC, there's the kind of typical one that you would think of where I send it over to my database guy and they go through it and they'll do as the best they can to look for these, say, batch effects. They'll look for whatever they can based on whatever data is still available in the company, because oftentimes companies will only look for QA/QC in their data sets for their ore and maybe a few other elements. They're not interested in things like niobium, yttrium, things that I use a lot. So like I'll have to do a deeper dive into the QA/QC. That said, so we have that company working on this piece. And then I'll get the report back and I'll figure out, okay, do things look good enough? But the other part of it is me getting pretty lost in the data and trying to figure out exactly what it is that I can do, I can't do, and the strategy of how I want to attack my actual interpretation. And that takes a long time because no two projects are the same. There will be similarities, but none of them are the same. And they all just require like a little special kind of massaging to figure out what the data can do, how old, how many different historic data sets sit within the same thing. It's really tricky and not straightforward. So any kind of questions that you guys have are legitimate, and hesitations that you have with using things like leveling are more valid than if you would just to blanket apply. And I love iogas, don't you guys get me wrong, but to blanket apply a z-score transformation or whatever other ones that they have in there that you can do, it's a tricky topic. So I'm really glad that we spent so much time talking about it. Everybody, that brings us to the end of today's episode and our 50th conversation on GeoChemistry. This one took us 3 recording sessions to do. Tom is giving us a heart in here. Maybe I'll see if I can have that somehow, or a little video in there. Anyway, 50th conversation, which I don't know what I expected when I started this. I didn't expect it to keep going on. The only reason that this is continuing is because of everybody that's ever approached me at a conference or sent me a little message to the GeoChemistea email on LinkedIn. I really appreciate what everybody brings to the table and hearing how this has helped them, impacted them, whatever it is, or has made them mad, that has given them an opinion on something. Today, we explored a topic that sits quietly behind a huge amount of geochemical interpretation, how we condition, normalize, and level data sets that ultimately drive particularly the maps we interpret, but also, as we got sidetracked multiple times, different exploration projects, also a lot of mining projects that I've worked on as well. A big thank you again to Tom Carmichael and Pedro Acosta-Gongora for bringing both the applied and mathematical perspectives to this discussion. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a colleague or early career geochemist who might find it useful. So until next time, just keep asking questions, keep looking at the data carefully, and of course, keep your tea hot. Thank you to our sponsor, LKI Consulting, and to It's Water and Coma Media for our music, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you all next month.